Sewing of saree cutting blouse. In the previous sessions, we cut the fabric pieces for the back piece, front piece, sleeves, hemming, binding and placket pieces for making a saree cutting blouse. In this session, we will see how to sew them together. At the end of the session, you will be able to sew the fabric pieces for a saree cutting blouse, check the quality of the finished product. Let's first familiarize with the tools and materials required for sewing a saree cutting blouse. They are cut-out fabric pieces, matching thread, sewing machine, a pair of small scissors, measuring tape, hooks, hand sewing needle, and iron box. First, let's see how to sew the facing for the back piece. Take the back piece and close the darts, starting from the cut edge to the peak marking. Then sew the back piece facing onto the back piece. Both darts should be folded towards the center of the back piece. Join the pieces with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Do a double stitched seam. Close the cut edge and fold the fabric as shown here. Sew along the fold to fix the facing on the back piece. Cut out the extra fabric. Thus we have completed facing for the back piece. Next, let's see how to sew the front piece. Take the front piece and close each dart from the cut edge to the peak marking. For both front pieces, we have 8 darts altogether. Then take the belt pieces, cut for each side, and sew them together at the lower edges and top stitch at the inner pieces. Attach the blouse piece with the outer belt piece with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Make sure that you push the dart inside the seam as shown here. Top stitch the inner belt piece hiding the seam. Make sure that the length of the left and right blouse center is the same. Thus we have attached belts to the front piece. Next, we will see how to sew the plackets for the front piece. For that, take the less wider placket piece and place on top of the right side blouse piece and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Top stitch on the other side. Fold the fabric as shown here. Sew and fix the placket. Then take the left side blouse piece and attach the wider placket piece. Place the right of the placket to the wrong side of the blouse piece and sew them together. Fold the placket as shown here. Mark the openings for the hook closure, making sure the distances are evenly spaced between 1¼ inches to 2 inches. Here, we will sew the openings for the hook closure while sewing the placket. Thus, we have finished sewing darts, waist belt and plackets for the front piece. Now let's join the shoulder seam of the front and back piece with a French seam. Now let's see how to sew the neckline. For that, join all the strips of the bias cut pieces as shown here. Press the seam open. Fold the bias piece into half. Next, secure the neck opening with the bias piece and apply pressing stitch. Thus we have finished sewing the shoulder seams and neckline for the saree cutting blouse. Next, we will sew the sleeves to the saree blouse. This is the front armhole and this is the back armhole. This is the front of the sleeve and this is the back of the sleeve. Now measure the opening of the armhole 3 by 8 inches away from the cut edge. Here the measurement is 17 3 by 4 inches. Now measure the sleeve head. Both the measurements should match. It is also fine if the sleeve measurement is little more than the armhole opening, but it shouldn't be less. Now insert the sleeves into the armhole and sew them. Sew the sleeve hem with a 1/2 inch hem width folded twice. Repeat the same for the other sleeve also. Then close the side seam from sleeve hem to waistline hem with a 1-inch seam allowance. Sew one or more stitched lines parallel to the first seam line. Thus we have finished sewing the sleeves and the side seam. Next, we will hand sew the bias neckline binding with a slip stitch. Next, we will sew and fix the hook closures. It is very important to verify the various aspects of quality of the finished product. So let's do a quality check to ensure that our saree cutting blouse is of good quality. Check if the darts are secured inside the belt line. Check if the lengths of both the front pieces are equal. Check if the neckline is neatly sewn. Check if the side seams are even and parallel. Check if the French seam at the shoulder seam is neat. Check if the hook closures and openings are properly done. Finally, see if the product has been ironed properly. In this session, we have learned how to sew the fabric pieces for a saree cutting blouse. Before we conclude, let's take a look at the key points involved in sewing a saree cutting blouse. Step 1. Sew the darts and facing for the back piece. Step 2. Sew the darts, waist belt and plackets for the front piece. Step 3. Sew the shoulder seams and neckline. Step 4. Sew the sleeves and close the side seam. Step 5. Hand sew the bias neckline binding with a slip stitch. Step 6. Sew and fix the hook closures. Step 7. Check the quality of the finished product. With that, we've come to the end of this session.